See You Now is a podcast highlighting the innovative and human-centered solutions that nurses are coming up with to solve for today's most challenging healthcare problems. Created in collaboration with Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Association, and hosted by nurse economist and health tech specialist, Shauna Butler.
Welcome to See You Now. I'm Shauna Butler. The swift development, authorization, and manufacture of the COVID-19 vaccines have been a remarkable feat that conjures up the great stories of scientific achievement, like landing on the moon, the discovery of penicillin and anesthetics, the sequencing of the human genome. While vaccines and vaccination are widely considered one of the greatest medical achievements of modern civilization and public health success stories, vaccines have, you might say, become a victim of their own remarkable success. A success that has led to complacency about the benefits of vaccination and to a focus on the potential risks or side effects. And that leads to vaccine hesitancy. And this hesitancy can compromise vaccination programs and leave populations susceptible to outbreaks, a situation where no one is truly safe because not enough of us are vaccinated. While we've seen remarkable progress in vaccine technology, progress in vaccine confidence and distribution, trust in science, and confidence in our institutions, that has been a different story. To better understand that story and answer some important questions it surfaces, in this episode, we talk with a range of innovators, experts, and vaccine champions on the forefront of vaccine education and dive deep into the science of vaccines, the ethics and details of clinical trials and vaccine distribution, and learn the many roles that nurses specifically play in developing vaccine confidence and innovating to rapidly and safely achieve mass vaccination, which will save hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths and get us back to those lives that include singing and dancing and celebrating and schooling and traveling, and so many of the things we're missing. Let's start with nurse and vaccine champion Lori Boyle.
I am Lori Boyle, and I am a nurse practitioner and vaccine advocate in New Jersey. And my experience in infectious disease just kind of led me towards the whole researching into vaccines. And curiously enough, I did discover a subset of people that were very hesitant about vaccines. My particular passion is ensuring that healthcare workers are properly vaccinated. So I actually help mostly dispel misinformation among healthcare workers.
Hold on a second. Healthcare workers, and particularly nurses, are the ones administering these vaccines. They're the ones sitting down with the patients, answering the questions they have about everything from the benefits, importance, safety, side effects, to the science of vaccines. Every day, nurses are translating what everyone is hearing in the news into real-life experiences and choices. And for good reason. Nurses are who the public trusts to give them accurate information. So why are healthcare workers hesitant about being the first to receive the COVID vaccines? And what are we doing to fix that? In order to answer this question, we checked in with nurse Ernest Grant. In his role as the president of the American Nurses Association, Ernest talks with nurses in every corner of the country about what they're thinking, seeing, experiencing, and feeling. In an effort to take a pulse on how to support America's nurses during and after this public health crisis, the ANA has been conducting a series of surveys. And in October of 2020, before any vaccine clinical trial data had been released, the ANA surveyed 13,000 nurses and explored their knowledge and attitude toward the COVID-19 vaccine development process. That survey provided a lot of insight into what nurses were thinking.
One of the things that we wanted to be able to do with COVID and getting information to the powers that be, and by that I mean, the administration, government officials who will be making decisions about either financing or distribution of supplies, they need to hear this. They need to see what's going on in Oregon versus what's going on in New Mexico versus what's going on in Vermont. And that's the great thing about all these surveys is that they are nurses from all over the country and including our territories as well, so that they have a really great picture of that. So we share that data. And one of our surveys was to ask if a vaccine were to come out, would you be willing to take it? Now, this was before we heard about Moderna and Pfizer and the efficacy rates that they had. So roughly it was about a third, and a third. A third says, yes, we will definitely take it. A third says, well, I'm on the fence. And then a third says, no. One of the reasons for doing the survey was we know that with nurses being the most trusted profession, and once a vaccine did come out, we are going to be the ones that patients and the public are going to listen to. And if the patients found out that, oh, well, this nurse that I trust, or this nurse who is in my neighborhood, or this nurse that I go to church with says they're not going to take it, begin to multiply that times, multiple times. And,
it's a huge impact.
We're going to have
it's a little bit of a problem.
Yes, just a little bit of a problem. So we are currently doing another survey. And so we're hoping that that second third that was on the fence would swing that, so that'll get us to about 66%. We want to get to at least 80 would be bare minimum. I'd love to get to 100%, but we know that there's going to be some challenges with that. But it would be interesting to see the results of the latest survey now that nurses know that we have a vaccine which have a very high efficacy rate. Previously, we were saying if we could get one with maybe 50 to 70% effective, we'll be shouting hallelujah.
Yeah.
Well, now we can shout hallelujah and amen.
I think that survey was very, very informative, and I'm really glad the ANA did it.
That was Christine Grady. Christine is a nurse bioethicist and a senior investigator who currently serves as the chief of the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center. Her research is primarily in the ethics of clinical research, including informed consent, study design, and recruitment, as well as ethical issues faced by nurses and other healthcare providers, and has studied and written at length about the moral distress that clinicians experience professionally. Christine came to the role following many years of clinical care that included significant experience with infectious diseases.
One of the things that struck me about that survey was the very important question that was asked about what the nurses who responded concerns were. Mm-hmm. And one of them, it was 84%, I think, of the nurses, it was the highest concern, was this all happened too fast. It was the speed with which these vaccines were developed. And so I think that, to me, provides an opportunity. And the opportunity is the following, that there is a lot of information. There's almost too much information. There's so much information about what these vaccines are, how they were developed, how they were evaluated, how the review processes went, and how the emergency use authorization went. And I think especially because nurses play so many roles in this play, it really is important for nurses to try to understand all those things.
Ernest Grant agrees.
The one thing that will help to persuade the ones who are on the fence and the ones who are saying no, I think it's very, very important that they understand how these mRNA or messenger RNA vaccines work as compared to what we normally think of when we think of a traditional vaccine.
And that's where Nurse Lori Boyle's work comes in handy.
I belong to an organization called Nurses Who Vaccinate. It's a wonderful organization founded by Melody Butler. She was dismayed about misinformation out there. And so our goal is to help correct misinformation and also to give other healthcare providers the tools that they need to help do the same thing, because a lot of times healthcare providers are surprised by what incorrect information is out there, and so they don't know how to respond to it. And then in turn, the people who have that incorrect perception take that as well, the doctor doesn't know kind of situation. So we're trying to arm other healthcare providers with the tools they need in order to compassionately and accurately refute incorrect information that's out there.
Yet, refuting incorrect information is just skimming the surface of what Lori is doing. Her means and methods go far beyond facts and statistics to reach people where they are in very fun, interesting, and highly memorable ways.
Research has shown that you just can't, put facts in people's faces and they're going to change their minds. It doesn't work that way. Most people will end up digging in their heels. So it has to be a gradual sort of thing. You start out with, I understand why you might feel that way. And then you present the correct information, and then you close again with, I understand what you're thinking, and I hope that what I said to you had an impact. And then me being me, I like to wrap my information around something that's fun. So I do that in costume. I make a theme every year of something, and because I am a little bit of a theatrical person, I always have been, I dress up in a costume.
The very first time we met, you appeared as Wonder Woman. And the next,
yes.
And the next time that we met, you showed up as Princess Leia. So.
Yes. And that actually, call it gimmicky. It catches people's attention and it makes it memorable.
Very clever. And her innovative methods of reaching out don't stop there. She's on all social media platforms with memes, videos, jokes, and above all, accurate information and resources encouraging people to get vaccinated. We'll get back to the importance of getting vaccinated, not just for yourself, but for others, in just a bit. But first, we know that some healthcare workers, and specifically nurses and nurses of color, have indicated their hesitancy when it comes to getting the COVID vaccines. And this hesitancy is complex, historic, and understandable. In this episode of See You Now, we wanted to explore in greater detail some of the issues of hesitancy. Lori sees it as her role and responsibility as a nurse to be educated on the science behind vaccines in order to effectively communicate this to her patients, the public, and especially to her colleagues.
I get the deep science from the people that really are doing the deep science. Microbiologists who are infectious disease specialists. I confer with them often to help me understand what the science is, and I think that's really where my role is learning what's going on and then translating it to the next level of people so that they understand it so they're not afraid of it.
That doesn't mean every nurse is going to want to take a vaccine, and I'm not saying that, but I do think nurses have the responsibility to be informed about how the vaccines were developed and how they're being offered.
Christine Grady.
Nurses have the responsibility to take care of themselves. But they also have two other really important roles in this. They have to be able to not only take care of people who are sick, but sometimes give the vaccine to people. So they have to have some level of feeling okay about that. And then the third role that I would say nurses have is as trusted examples. People look to nurses for guidance, neighbors, friends, relatives. They ask the nurse they know, what do you think about the vaccine? And so again, I think it's really important for nurses to have the information about how it works and how people get it and how they feel when they get it. All the details are really important for nurses to know about, as well as how to point people to resources where they can find information that a nurse might not know about. The CDC resources, the ANA resources, the FDA resources. There's a lot of places where people can learn about the details if they want to know. And nurses can help guide them in that.
So what are the main questions when it comes to the COVID vaccine? And maybe more importantly, what are the answers to those questions?
One of the biggest questions is how can we trust this vaccine because it's so fast? How can we develop a vaccine this quickly? Never before in the history of science and medicine have we watched this kind of thing unfold in real time. And that's kind of one of the challenges, though, too, because people that are in science know how arduous the process is and why it doesn't happen quickly. And because we are in an instant information age, people are used to getting an answer quickly, and we don't have answers quickly with this, even with regard to the disease itself. That's one of the challenges that people say, well, why, last week they said this and this week they said that, and why is it always changing? And they can't get their story straight. And that's one of the things I try and impress upon people. I said, we are learning it as we go. And that is a basic tenet of science and medicine, is that as the evidence evolves, so does the message. And as frustrating as it may be, what was the right thing to say 3 months ago is not the right thing to say today.
Lori makes an important point about the nature and rigor of science and research. Science produces layers of information, knowledge, and understanding. And as humans, we aren't always comfortable with that uncertainty and with not knowing, especially when it comes to making consequential decisions about our health. We want answers, and we want them now. That's one reason why it's so hard to communicate science to the public, particularly during a rapidly evolving public health crisis. Yet, as much as we want to speed up the scientific process, seeing things develop so quickly can also cause uncertainty for a public that's been told that science takes time. To be patient with science. Christine Grady.
So it is a remarkable feat of science in the following sense, that this was the fastest process of developing, testing, and of authorizing a vaccine that we've ever seen in history. So it did go fast, but they didn't cut corners.
Christine is spot on. Scientists from around the world in a range of disciplines have been working on vaccines and the mRNA technology for decades. I'd like you to meet one.
It's part of my job, and it is part of my passion to educate people about viruses. I find them fascinating. They can be our enemy, or we can manipulate them to be our friends, as in gene therapy. My name is Jackie Dudley. I'm a professor of molecular biosciences at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm an associate director of LaMontagne Center for Infectious Disease. I've been teaching virology for almost 40 years, and I believe strongly in vaccines as our best tool to fight off viral infections. I have received the vaccine as soon as I could sign up. I signed up. I have spent much of my life educating people about viruses and also the benefits of being vaccinated.
We're in a new generation of vaccine developments with the mRNA, messenger RNA.
Right.
That is new to a lot of us. It's not necessarily new to the scientists. You guys have been working on this for 15, maybe 20 years? I mean, this is
longer than that. I mean, okay. In terms of, knowing what a messenger RNA is,
mm-hmm.
The concept of using it for vaccines is a much newer one.
Okay. So I think clearly we understand what a live attenuated is pretty clear. Messenger RNA vaccines, that starts to get into a level of molecular biology and complexity that is for a special group of people like you to help us all understand. So let me put you in the role of what nurses do. When we give vaccines to people, we are talking sometimes to a 5-year-old, sometimes to a college student who is studying in the life sciences and they have a good understanding. Sometimes we're talking to somebody who's blind. Sometimes we're talking to a 50-year-old, an adult who's trying to make a decision for their 75-year-old parent. So we've got this broad range of people that we're speaking to with varying levels of scientific base understanding. And so we need to have the understanding ourselves, but then be able to translate it to speak directly to that person in front of us who has excellent questions. And we're grateful that they want to understand more about this to take better care of themselves. So I put that out there in the context of when you give this explanation back to me, I want to have the deep scientific understanding. I want to have the ability to translate it so that I can speak to any of my audiences and any of the people that I'm caring for.
Okay. So at the very basis of our being, who we are, our genes, That is stored in our DNA. That is the same in every cell. Then we actually take bits of that information in each cell, which is put into short-term code where we make a specific protein. And that particular code is what makes a liver cell different than a lung cell. So we're taking the genetic code and then we're making a copy of a piece of that genetic code to make a protein. And that can be a gene for insulin, or it can be a gene for a virus.
So a good guy and a not so good guy.
Well, if it is a piece of the virus that's going to give us immunity to it, it's a good guy.
Yeah. How we deploy these tools. Yeah.
Yeah. We've taken essentially a normal biological process and sort of flipped the odds on the incoming attacker and say, okay, we've already seen you before, and we've made you by the normal cell process, just like we would make insulin in our own bodies. And now our immune system recognizes when we are attacked by an invader like the coronavirus. So the virus is an infectious nanoparticle. And in this technology, we're taking a piece of the virus, which is not transmissible, and packaging it in something that the cells will take up and then recognize it to make it into the viral protein. And it's just one viral protein. The virus makes many proteins.
How long have we been thinking about messenger RNA as an immunology solution?
It's been in the last 5 or 10 years. And it's not just being thought of as use for vaccines, but also, say, for genetic diseases where someone is missing the appropriate copy of their particular protein. This is all part of gene therapy.
Right.
Being able to deliver either through a virus where we're inserting a normal gene to let the virus deliver it. Now we're just looking at different other vehicles to deliver it.
So a lot of questions have come up across the board. People wondering, wow, this vaccine was developed so fast. Maybe we need to pause just a little bit. As I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is it feels fast, but the base science, the foundational science upon which this is built actually has been around for quite some time, very well tested, many people in the field testing it, looking at lots of different applications. So
right.
While it may be getting its limelight at the moment, and we're seeing it used, it really isn't new science. It isn't new technology. These are things that have been in the works for decades.
Yes.
That's fair?
Yes, okay. That's fair.
So the science of gene therapy is a robust one.
Right.
We got a lot of people working on it.
Yeah, that's been decades. And there's been, admittedly, many hurdles to that process. It's now becoming more back in favor, and we're talking about new things like CRISPR, and we're just at the edge of a revolution in terms of treatments.
So there you have it, folks. The science behind the COVID vaccines. It has been fast, but it's been based on many, many years of rigorous science and research across multiple domains. And yet, what we've learned, understanding the basic science isn't always enough. Many questions, good questions, remain, and people are asking them. Again, Lori Boyle.
They're asking, how do we know that it's safe?
Yeah.
That's a biggie. Part of the way we know it's safe are the clinical trials. And then safety trials are done first. So safety trials are done before they start doing what the phase 3 clinical trials. A lot of safety stuff is done during phase 2.
Yes, the clinical trials. Each week, we're learning more from the vaccine trials underway as each vaccine candidate seeks authorization and as more vaccines are administered around the world. When we recorded our interview with scientist Jackie Dudley, she was able to speak to the data published from the trials of the 2 vaccines that had been authorized for emergency use in the U.S.
There were 2 huge clinical trials by both Pfizer and Moderna, which are the vaccines that are currently being used. Those showed very clearly that you're preventing clinical disease if people had the vaccine. They used volunteers, and they had a control group that did not receive the messenger RNA, the viral protein, and they had ones that did receive it. And there was a highly significant difference between the 2 groups. So that is the way all vaccines are tested. This was very accelerated because of the emergency of the problem. The scientific evidence says that this works and that this is safe and that the side effects are what you would expect from any other vaccine. You may feel a little not up to par for a day, but it's much better than the long-term consequences that we've seen from the coronavirus infection.
So who participates in a clinical trial? What is a clinical trial like? What problems have existed in past trials? And what's been done to address them? Let me introduce someone to you again.
I'm Dr. Ernest Grant, president of the American Nurses Association, and I am also a COVID vaccine clinical trials participant, and I'm happy to talk about my experiences.
I was reading an article in which you had been interviewed about your participation in a clinical trial. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you said is, I thought it was imperative to serve as a role model, not only to nurses who need to be involved and included in the COVID-19 vaccine development, but also for Black people who have been historically underrepresented when it comes to vaccine testing. And as a result, it was especially important for me to be that representation, given the disproportionate effect of COVID-19 in our Black communities. So let's talk about your journey and your story. And I see kind of your role as investigative journalism. You're in there and you're seeing how the trial unfolds and kind of reporting back to us. What are you seeing, and how are you gaining confidence to know that the trials really include people that look like them?
One of the things that I try to impart when I'm speaking specifically to people of color, that may be hesitant about wanting to take the vaccine, is that it is important that we see people of color that have participated in the trial, because one of the things you want to make sure is that this is a vaccine that is effective in all races and ethnicities. I know for the Moderna trial, they had 33,000 that participated. Of that, 10% were African American. So it's really great they would have that so that they can remove those doubts that people may have. So yes, we have to embrace the distrust that you may have based on what we know in the past. The Tuskegee experiment, the Henrietta Lacks experiments, the experiment that happened on Black soldiers in World War I and II using gas and not being told. But as a result of that, what we learned is that now you can't do that because that was brought to light. Now we have the informed consent, the IRB review board, the FDA. We have, a system of checks and balances in place to ensure that we do have transparency and it's there. And if you want to review the data, you can certainly do that. Or if you need explanations, and that's the reason why the informed consent, they have to review that with you. And sometimes, 2 or 3 times before you even sign on the dotted line, and that you can drop out of the study at any time and not be punished as a result of it. So I think things like that helps to ease any anxiety that they may have or angst that they may have, and hopefully will convince them that, okay, yes, I will participate, or yes, I will take the vaccine.
And the other part of this is the scientific process, because right now we are at a moment in time across the globe, actually, where confidence in science isn't at its highest, and we've seen a deterioration. And I think the best way to develop confidence in science is to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
And so first of all, how do you find a trial?
Well, in my case, I guess you could call it maybe a little miracle because I had been thinking about it for
Wait a minute. We were talking
days.
about science, not
Yes,
miracles.
I know. And now we're bringing in the ethereal. I know, but I had been thinking about it, and then I got an email from a physician colleague of mine. He just asked me if I thought that I would be interested in participating, that they were doing the Moderna trial. And said, sure, I'll be happy to. And we set up a time to discuss the informed consent. And then we did it again. And then I was invited into UNC Hospital's clinical trials unit. So I went there, was given a complete physical from head to toe, and more paperwork, of course.
We're healthcare,
and
right?
Then, yes, absolutely. And then they made the determination that yes, you do qualify. So then I had to get some blood drawn, just baseline, just to make sure that I had not had COVID. So they did blood draw as well as the nasal swab, which I hated. So then we waited for the vaccine to arrive, or placebo. It's a double-blind study, so you had no idea, which you were getting.
When we say double-blind, that means you as the participant, you don't know?
Do not know, neither does the researcher know. So anyway, and even right before I got the injection, it was, are you sure is your opportunity to back out if you want to? No, go ahead. So they did. And then while we were waiting on either the vaccine or the placebo to arrive, they loaded my phone up with this little app. And, once you get the injection, you will be asked to log on to this device every so often for the first week. It would actually trigger you. And the questions were, what are you experiencing? Having any chills, fever, You had to take your temperature and record that. And anything else that you could think of that possibly was going wrong. Do you have a fever? Do you have a rash? Do you have soreness at the injection site? That type of thing. Are you feeling lightheaded or having headaches or anything that could possibly be like a reaction? So with the first shot, you were to keep that diary. I think it was about every 4 hours or so that I was logging in for maybe a week to 10 days. And then after that, it went to 2 or 3 times a day. And then I had to go back within 3 weeks to get the second injection. Pretty much the same thing. The blood draw, got the injection again, and then again, still had to keep the diary. Well, I got the second shot. I distinctly remember it was about 11 o'clock that day. You had to remain at the clinical site each time you got the injection for at least half an hour, just to make sure you were not having any allergic reaction or anything like that. I went and got some lunch, came home, was working, finished my day about 4:30, 5 o'clock. I was sitting on the couch watching the 6:30 news, and then suddenly it's almost like, wham, I got hit by a Mack truck. And just extreme fatigue. And so much so that I just said, man, I'm just going to go up and lay down. And so I did. And about 5-6 hours later, I woke up and I realized that I was having chills. So the next morning, I called the clinical trials unit to report, I don't have a fever. The only thing I have is chills and fatigue. Probably about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, all that went away, but I was still able to work the whole day, although I was sitting at my desk with a little blanket around my legs because of how chilled I was. But it wasn't, I was not incapacitated in any way. And ever since then, I have felt fine. I will be followed for 2 years. As time goes by, the amount of time to report or to go in for a clinic visit is extended out further and further.
So when it comes to the COVID vaccines, we have nurses leading on the front lines of care. We have nurses leading on the global level, participating in trials. And we have nurses leading the ethical discussions, debates, and design. And this is really important because there are a lot of ethical considerations when it comes to vaccines, especially vaccine trials. Again, nurse and bioethicist Christine Grady. Lay out for us the ethical considerations in maybe the design of the trials, recruiting participants, just, from the standpoint of what are the ethical considerations of vaccine trials?
Sure. So when I talk about vaccines, I like to say there's ethics from the very beginning to the very end. And I think there is. From the time we do basic science to try to understand what is the cause of a specific infectious disease? How can we isolate it? How can we understand the kind of protective, natural protection that people have against it, if there is any? And how can we use that, capitalize on that, to create in the laboratory a vaccine that might be able to either enhance that level of protection or prevent people from getting sick to begin with? And so all of that comes with decisions that have values associated with them, and therefore they are not just scientific decisions, they're ethical decisions. Then we get to the point at which, in the development of a vaccine, once we have some of that basic understanding and basic science and in vitro work, then it needs to go into animal trials and then clinical trials with people. And so clinical trials of vaccines in people go through the standard multiple phases of clinical trial development, looking at safety, looking at immunogenicity, looking at efficacy. And it's really important for people to recognize that in vaccine research, we have a really different kind of threshold than we do, for example, in drug research, in the following sense, that safety is absolutely paramount, because vaccines are going to be used in healthy people who are not sick, who may never get sick, but might be at risk of getting sick. And therefore, the safety profile has to be really great, because we want lots of people to take it across lots of different groups of people. And it has to work. It has to work at a level that will protect people from getting sick. So those two, of course, safety and efficacy are the key to any clinical trial, but those are really critical in vaccine development because of how it's going to be used. Then vaccine trials are different than drug trials in two other ways. One is, I've already mentioned, healthy people that we ask to undertake the risk of vaccines, if there is any risk. And the second is the numbers. In phase 3 clinical trials of vaccines, it's normal to have tens of thousands of healthy people who stick their arm out and get a vaccine or get a placebo in order to help us understand if this vaccine is safe and efficacious enough for widespread use. And so there's so many interesting questions along the way in terms of who we ask to do that. Certainly people should be volunteers, no matter what. And they are healthy, as I mentioned, depending on the disease. So let's just take COVID as an example. In the COVID vaccine trials, it was very important to have people that represented a wide range of age, because we know that people who are older have a higher degree of getting really sick from COVID and dying from COVID. So they wanted to make sure in those vaccine trials that they had people over a certain age. We also already knew that people who had certain comorbidities were more at risk from COVID. So they wanted to be sure that there were people that represented those comorbidities in vaccine trials.
So people who had other underlying type of diseases like diabetes or congestive heart failure.
Okay. Exactly.
Right.
We also recognize that COVID has a differential impact on people of color. And so it was very important to make sure that the vaccine trials included people who represented all of those who ultimately would be using a vaccine and benefit from a vaccine, including the people who are most at risk from COVID. So selecting participants for those vaccine trials had to take all of that into account.
You mentioned a very important topic, and that is including people of color in our vaccine trials. There's a very important reason why people of color have a reluctance, distrust of any type of medical trial. And it's certainly a sad moment in ethics around medical trials when we think back to some of the instances of where people of color have lost trust in the medical community. Can you speak to that and walk us through what we've learned from past errors and what we need to do at this moment, ethically, clinically, medically, for us to have a level of confidence in the ethics that are being applied to our vaccine trials?
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways I want to approach that question. One is specifically to your question about trust in communities of color, or lack of trust in communities of color. And some of that is, as you said, justified in a certain way because of historical examples of the way people have been treated, and not just in clinical research, but in in society, in healthcare.
Yeah.
And so for people to have suspicions and some distrust about the medical community or the research community or the establishments that exist that run these trials, it's warranted. And how do we get past it? So we get past it by being as open and honest about everything that's going on in the research, in the trials, in the delivery of vaccines, giving people the opportunity to ask questions, to get facts, get details and evidence and things like that, and to talk to people that they trust about what they should do in a given situation. Should they be in this trial? Should they get the vaccine? And that's a challenge. And I think a lot of people recognize the challenge, and people are trying very hard to work on it. But another important part of this is for everyone to recognize the sort of multiple layers of review and approval and scrutiny that research goes through. So there are unfortunate historical examples that should never have been done. And in today's world, the chances of any of those kinds of studies being done are so low. And the reason they're so low is because of the level of scrutiny. So for a study to be done, any kind of study that involves human beings, it goes through what's called an institutional review board. And the institutional review board's job is to say, are the benefits of doing this study worth the risks, and the risks to the individuals in particular? And are the people that are being asked to participate being told everything they need to be told in the process of informed consent? And are they being selected fairly? So all of those things are things that IRBs do. And IRBs spend a lot of time making studies better before they begin. Once a study begins, especially large studies, especially clinical trials of vaccines, there is what's called the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, which is in place to follow both the data and, importantly, the risks, safety, and efficacy of this, whatever the intervention that is being tested. And data and safety monitoring boards meet regularly. They look at all of the data, and they make decisions about, should the study continue as is? Should something be adjusted, or should it stop?
You mentioned the IRBs, the institutional or internal review boards. Who sits on those boards? Who's making these decisions? And how are they invited? How are they qualified? How do we make sure that that group of people who are playing referee in many situations, how do we know that they really are protecting the interests of children or people who might not be able to make an informed consent?
Mm-hmm. Who's on IRB? So there are scientists, there are nurses, there are members of the community, there are sometimes bioethicists, sometimes lawyers, sometimes clergy. I mean, it's a variety of people that are asked to think together about a particular study. Almost every institution that has an IRB has some training, orientation and training for those members. So there's an understanding of what their tasks are and what they do together. And most institutions require that training on a regular basis.
Okay, so we've got an ethically designed trial that is large, that is inclusive, that is covering the broad range of people that this, and we'll just use this vaccine is designed to protect.
Right.
Now we're moving on to the authorization and approval process. That's a whole other piece where the ethical considerations need to come in place. Sure. I will say this year I was grateful that the FDA made these hearings available online for everyone to see. And I think it speaks to the moment. But the big question that keeps coming up is, how do I have trust in the approval and authorization process? So to our resident bioethicist here, answer that question for me and 4 million friends who are asking.
Yeah. So they looked for safety in, at that point, 75,000 people. And the data was pretty impressive. In those 75,000 people, they were able to show, with the number of people who got COVID, who were not vaccinated, compared to the people who got COVID who were vaccinated, the difference showed a 95% or 94% efficacy. And that led to the authorization by the FDA. There's an advisory committee called the Vaccine and Related Products Advisory Committee, I think is the name of it, VRPAC. Mm-hmm. And they had hearings that were open. People could listen in. They put all of the materials on the website so people could read the materials, listen to the debate. And VRBPAC makes a recommendation to the FDA. And the basis of their recommendation is that the benefits of the particular vaccine candidate are good and justify any risks. And so those were both authorized by the FDA for emergency use. And that's what we're getting. That's what many of us are getting now.
I find it really fascinating the way you are, again, describing it and positioning it, that it wasn't a function of someone saying, this is perfect or this is safe. What they are saying is the risks. It's really answering a question from an ethics basis of,
absolutely,
do we stand to have a greater gain than we do the risk of some untoward event?
Yeah.
Your framing is very much the decision around this, and the thinking is really coming from an ethics point of view. So,
and I think if you read for example, the guidance that FDA puts out about how they make decisions under an EUA, it is a risk-benefit calculation. That's how we do it. And so that's ethics, right?
Ethics is about choice. It's a risk-benefits calculation. Like Christine said, it's about what are we willing to do and the risks we are willing to take in order to be safe, not just as individuals, but as communities, as civilizations. In terms of thinking about how we gauge these trade-offs, Jackie Dudley has a helpful analogy.
It's like getting in your car and not putting on your seatbelt.
It's a great analogy, and we still have questions about vaccines. Here's another question that's coming up a lot. If you've had that vaccine, how likely are you to be somebody who's transmitting the virus?
Right. Your chance is lower, but it's not zero.
Which is why we have to still keep wearing masks.
Yes.
So we started out with a couple hundred vaccine candidates, right?
Right.
And then based on how effective they were and how safe they were, we would start to narrow them down. And then we're getting some that are coming onto the market and requesting approval. As an individual, how do I make the decision? Is one vaccine more effective than another? Is one safer? How would I make the decision around which vaccine I would want to have?
Well, I think the availability is a big problem.
Just go get whichever one you can get?
Yes. If it has been shown to be effective, then in my view, I want one that has been proven to be safe, has been proven to be effective, and I can get it as soon as possible. I mean, when the virus is rampant in all communities in the United States, you can't wait for the perfect candidate to come along. And these have been shown to be 95%, which is amazing. So these vastly outperformed what we were expecting.
So
right.
What I'm hearing and what I'm having you confirm for me is that the only difference around these vaccines has to do with a logistics issue, has nothing to do with a safety or an effectiveness.
That's correct. There is no reason to think that these are not effective or safe. I feel very strongly that a vaccine is better than no vaccine and taking your chances out there to get the live virus.
And millions of people are eagerly waiting for their vaccine. But there's not enough doses at the moment for all those who need and want them. Reports of vaccine shortages and the difficulty in getting an appointment to get one are all over the news. So how do we decide who gets the vaccine and when? Again, Christine Grady.
Those are ethical decisions. And there were a number of groups, including the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, the Advisory Council on Immunization Practices that advises the CDC, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts for the WHO, and a number of academics who worked out a framework for how vaccine ought to be allocated if there weren't enough vaccine for everybody at the beginning. And although each of them has slightly different terminology for how they worked out their frameworks, it seems like they all agree on at least some of the principles or the values that guide it. And the first one that almost all of them agreed on was that we should choose the people to get the vaccine initially in order to maximize the benefit. And so in order to maximize the benefit, you can think about it in a number of ways. One is the benefit of getting the vaccine for the person to protect them from getting sick and dying from COVID. Maximize the benefit in terms of keeping people healthy who we need to do other things, like nurses and other healthcare workers who we need to make sure they're healthy so they can take care of the rest of us and other people who are in essential kinds of positions. And also fairness and equity in distributing vaccines. So all of those are really important, and all of those were the values that were the background for the prioritization schemes that came out.
But there is a larger story to the history of vaccinations, and a goal beyond that of getting out of this pandemic. Jackie Dudley.
And the goal really, with any type of virus, is eradication.
Right.
How do vaccines fit into the eradication strategy?
This has been going on for things like poliovirus for years. They've been trying to eliminate the virus, but in general, the virus survives because people are afraid to take the vaccine. And they are suspicious of the people who are vaccinating. So there's still cases that occur in, say, Afghanistan. It's often in war-torn, uneducated populations that do not understand that this is going to protect them from a deadly, debilitating disease. And they're more likely to distrust the government, which is another sentiment that's been legitimately expressed, is when there's been so much misinformation out there that who do I believe? And I think the default is to do nothing. Mm. To eradicate this disease, we have to be proactive. And we also have to realize that there's something called herd immunity. And this is a collective thing. Some people cannot take it because of their immune status. They are immunocompromised. So to protect those people, we have to do it as a community. This is part of our obligation as Americans to help other people who cannot take the vaccine be protected. It's a civic duty. It really is.
Yeah.
There is no scientific basis for thinking that this vaccine is doing harm.
Now we're looking to nurses to innovate in new and novel ways. And that may mean developing new technologies, new protocols, new partnerships, new designs, and more. Christine Grady. Clearly, during a pandemic, there is an imperative for research, an ethical imperative. Is there an ethical imperative for innovation during this moment in time?
I think so. I actually think research is a kind of innovation, actually. And, sort of, if you think of innovation in the broad sense of what it is, it's, creating or developing something new that hopefully has the possibility of improving things, making things better, either more efficient, more effective, more whatever. And
equitable.
So equitable, absolutely. And research is, that's what research is about, really. So, and innovation, some people like to distinguish research and innovation, but in the broader way of understanding innovation, I think research is an innovation. If I think about the intersection of ethics and innovation, I think in innovating, we also need to think about not only why we're doing it, but how we're doing it. And so when, we talked before about in research, you have to think carefully about what the questions are and who you invite to participate and how you measure outcomes and things like that. I think innovation has some of those same requirements. You think about why you're doing it, how you're going to figure it out, how you're going to test it, so to speak, and who it's going to impact when you do test it or when you put it into implementation phase. And those are all ethical questions. But we really do need people who want to study ethics, who want to do research in ethics, who want to lead the ethics presence in hospitals and in universities and in corporations and in other places, who are nurses, because they understand the patient side of things in ways that my wonderful colleagues who are philosophers and lawyers don't. They understand other things that they bring to the table that are also important, but they don't have that patient perspective that I think is so valuable. The clinical perspective is so valuable.
Yeah, the human perspective. So innovation today, as Nurse Lori Boyle points out, could be as simple or as complex as creating space for conversation, education, and questions. Innovation in making this happen, because we've seen a lot of innovations that have been in place just to create the vaccine. The fact that 100 years ago, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have genomic-based medicine. We weren't doing gene sequencing. We didn't have the types of communication that we do right now. What are some of the innovations that you're seeing as far as the education and the distribution?
Nothing has ever been done on this big a scale. I mean, the last time there was a big, large-scale vaccination program was probably like polio vaccine, and that involved doing vaccinations in school. And now we're in the social media age, and that's an entirely different animal. We never had this kind of instant access to information and widespread information to everybody all at once. So I do believe that, the World Wide Web is going to help us in that respect with getting information out there. As far as mobilizing physically, that's going to take a little bit more creative work. I think that it would be not a bad idea to get people like EMTs and paramedics involved. All those people that you don't think of necessarily giving vaccines, but do have medical training that can help.
I think we should just throw it out there to say, who else should we be thinking about in this vaccination workforce that we need to mobilize? Mm-hmm. Lori, is there anything else that you wanted to share that I have not asked?
The only thing I ask of people is that if you have a question, don't keep it to yourself. Ask somebody. My advice to everybody is keep talking, keep asking questions, because that's the only way we learn. That's the only way we move forward.
Vaccines are remarkable. They represent remarkable science, innovation, public health, human endeavor, and a remarkable social exercise that has us all thinking and innovating on how best to overcome a deadly virus, and to do so ethically, equitably, safely, swiftly, affordably, and confidently. The information, as nurses Christine Grady and Lori Boyle mentioned, can be overwhelming and the logistics daunting. But vaccinations provide the safest and most effective path forward. They are our best shot, pun intended, at restoring a sense of normalcy to our lives. And nurses who are combining technology and innovation are playing an essential role in managing, accelerating, assessing every step of this massively complex operation. Real-world and real-time data in managing the supply chain, enabling registration and scheduling of vaccinations, tracking safety data, understanding how vaccinations are reducing risk of infection and serious disease, and demographic reporting to help public health systems stay focused on getting the vaccines, the resources, and the services where and when they're needed. Throughout this pandemic, I've been part of that clinical nursing workforce, administering COVID tests, and now administering COVID vaccines. And what I've experienced is vaccine gratitude. People actually thank me and my colleagues for putting a swab up their nose or a needle in their deltoid, and for clear, understandable, accurate information. It's uplifting and it's affirming seeing people share their vaccine enthusiasm through photos, stories, applause, happy dances, and at times, even tears of joy and gratitude. So, to all the scientists, researchers, clinical trial participants, internal review board members, regulators, clinicians, journalists, manufacturers, quality control, supply chain specialists, delivery and logistics managers, data technology specialists, and many others who have been part of this historic endeavor, we thank you, we salute you, and we roll up our sleeves for you. So please join me and nurses around the globe who are cultivating vaccine confidence, gratitude, and enthusiasm. And special thanks to our guests and experts, nurse practitioner and vaccine superhero Lori Boyle, ANA President Nurse Ernest Grant, nurse bioethicist Christine Grady, and virus researcher and scientist Jackie Dudley. For See You Now, I'm Shauna Butler. Thanks for listening and for getting vaccinated.
See You Now is created in collaboration with Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Association. Johnson & Johnson is proud to power up nurse-led innovation that is transforming health outcomes through skill building, leadership development, and more. The American Nurses Association ignites and celebrates nurse-led innovation to redefine quality nursing and advance healthcare for all. To learn more about these programs and See You Now, visit seeyounowpodcast.com. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, or practices of the speaker's employer or any organization. The speakers also do not speak on behalf of Johnson & Johnson. This podcast is intended for informational purposes only, does not provide medical advice, and is not a substitute for professional medical diagnosis or treatment.